So thank you everyone for being here. My name is Claire Hofmeyer and I'm the Education and Training Manager at JPAL Africa. I work as part of the Jobs and Opportunity Initiative team, and I'm joined by some of my colleagues who will have more to say later in the session. I'd love to know who else is here with us. If you feel comfortable doing so, it would be great if you could introduce yourself in the chat box. And we're really thrilled that all of you have accepted the invitation to join today's information session as we discuss Joy's Spring 2022 RFP and our African Scholars Program. So without further ado. All right, so to give you an overview of what we'll cover, I'm going to kick us off with an introduction to JPAL's Jobs and Opportunity Initiative, which we call JOY for short, including the kinds of research topics we focus on and the different types of funding we provide. I'll then take you through the components of the African Scholars Program, which some of you here may already know about, but hopefully the repetition is useful anyway. And then after that, I'll take you through some tips on how to put together a winning proposal, and we'll end with a Q&A session. Please feel free to ask us anything during that session. We particularly encourage you to ask questions about your potential research idea, because the JOY staff who've joined me and have introduced themselves in the chat have an in-depth knowledge of the labor literature, and they can direct you to studies that relate to your research. So please feel free to post questions in the chat as we go if you don't want to wait until the Q&A session. I will be sharing these slides as well as some other resources I mentioned along the way after the webinar by email. So first, let's kick it off with an introduction to the Jobs and Opportunity Initiative, or as I said before, JOY. So we launched the Jobs and Opportunity Initiative because I think, as we all well know, millions of people around the world are unemployed or stuck in low quality jobs. So to put a number on that, across the globe, more than 220 million people were unemployed as of 2020. Youth on average face triple the unemployment rate faced by adults, and unemployment can contribute to low productivity, low incomes, and reduced social cohesion. And then even for people who do have work, many face low earnings, difficult hours, unsafe conditions, and insufficient benefits. And so in response, governments and NGOs around the world are responding with active labor market policies and private sector development reforms. But the evidence on which solutions work and which work best is inconclusive. And this makes it really hard for us to be able to give helpful input to policymakers who are making difficult decisions about their programs and strategies. Randomized evaluations are a powerful tool to improve our understanding of a whole range of phenomena, including labor markets. So JPAL works with a global network of more than 220 researchers around the world who are all dedicated to conducting high quality randomized evaluations. And you may have heard news a couple of years ago when Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, JPAL's founders, along with their long-standing colleague Michael Kramer, were recognized with a Nobel Prize in Economics for their work using this methodology of randomized evaluations to advance evidence-based poverty alleviation efforts. So apologies for those of you whom this is repetitive, but to make sure that we're all on the same page, I thought it could be helpful to give a really brief overview of what a randomized evaluation or randomized control trial, different names for the same thing, what it is and how it helps us to rigorously measure the impact of an intervention. So I think probably we all know there are many types of impact evaluations. For example, pre-post analysis, simple difference, difference in difference, multivariate, etc. But the method that JPAL uses is RCTs, randomized evaluations, because they are the most rigorous way to estimate the causal impact of a given program. So how does it work at its most basic? Individuals are randomly assigned to two groups. In expectation, the two groups have comparable characteristics at baseline. In practice, the two groups may be different from each other due to random variation, but if the groups are large enough, these differences are likely to be negligible at baseline. And then that means that the only systematic difference between the treatment and control groups is that the treatment receives the intervention and the control group does not. If the sample is large enough, we can conclude that any difference at the end of the program between the two groups is due to the intervention and not anything else like characteristics of the sample or outside events that occurred at the same time. So JOY applies this methodology of randomized evaluations to test innovative solutions to employment challenges. Our research focuses on three main buckets of work: job training and matching, job creation, and the future of work. So let me summarize what we mean by these three buckets. Training and matching includes programs that try to improve the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of programs that train workers, as well as programs that reduce search barriers for job seekers. Job creation refers to interventions that create new forms of employment. These could come in the form of public works programs or through providing support to small and micro entrepreneurs that helps them to grow their businesses and hire more people. And then in the third bucket, the future of work, we have programs that prepare workers for the changing demands of the labor market, such as more jobs going online, as well as interventions that protect gig and informal workers who lack access to traditional social protection. In this bucket, we also include programs that promote the ability of women to be able to fully participate in the labor market. So here are a few examples of the research questions we invite proposals to address. There are more examples on our website, and in that email I'll send after this webinar, I'll be including the RFP overview, and that goes into these questions in more detail. But some examples are always helpful. So looking at training and matching. Which design features of skills training programs have the most impact? Or what are the most effective ways to align people's expectations with the realities of the labor market? And how can technology platforms serve this purpose? And which policies are most effective at reducing hiring discrimination? If we turn to job creation, some questions include, what are effective targeting mechanisms to identify high potential entrepreneurs? And what are the key constraints that women and youth face to running successful businesses? And what forms of alternative business training are best suited to helping participants overcome them? And then finally, in the third bucket, the future of jobs. How can economies best prepare their workers for the changing demands of the labor market? And how can economies harness technology advances to improve job opportunities for both high-skilled and low-skilled workers? For example, how can programs best connect marginalized youth to internet-based employment? So I'd like to walk you through the three different types of funding that JOY provides. First, we have proposal development grants. So these grants cover exploratory work related to preliminary research ideas, such as conducting background research, developing partnerships, visiting field sites, and collecting preliminary data. Funds can also be used for activities intended to facilitate access to administrative data for designing or conducting an RCT. The expectation is that these funds will be used to support activities that will allow your team to develop a proposal for a pilot or a full-scale RCT that would then be submitted in a subsequent request for proposals round. And the maximum amount awarded here is $10,000 US. Our second type of funding is for pilot studies. So these grants are for studies with a clear research question, but for which the design and implementation requires further testing and pilot data. So a pilot requires a partnership with an implementing partner, but you don't yet need to have a fully formed design or use a randomization strategy necessarily. You may do, but you don't have to. So for example, you could use survey or admin data during a pilot, if that's relevant and helpful to fully developing your RCT design. Pilots are generally used to test the logistical viability of the program and or the take-up of the program, as this allows you to assess the impacts you expect to find in the larger study. And the expectation is that these projects will ultimately develop into full-scale randomized evaluations. So I want to stress this point. When JPAL talks about a pilot, we mean a pilot of a full-scale evaluation. So the next step after a pilot is to run a full-scale RCT, assuming your pilot's findings indicate that this would be a good idea. We do not fund pilots where the next step is to scale up the intervention without a further, more intensive evaluation. And in this bucket, the maximum amount that you can ask for is $75,000 US. And then finally, we have full randomized evaluations. These grants are for research projects at a mature level of development. Not only must your research question be clear, but you must also demonstrate a commitment from implementing partners. You must have a method of randomization, well-defined instruments, and sample size estimates. The expectation is that these projects will result in a publicly available publication that is eventually submitted to a top economics journal. And the maximum you can ask for here is $400,000. I will note there in the orange box at the bottom that in order to be eligible to apply for a full randomized evaluation, African scholar teams need to first successfully complete a pilot for that same project funded by JPAL. And I'll talk about this a little bit more shortly. All right, so I've given you a very brief overview of JOY. Now I'd like to give you an overview of the African Scholars Program, which is a mechanism we're using to open up JPAL funding to scholars working on the continent. So first, our motivation for the program. There are a number of barriers that local researchers face in being able to conduct research, particularly experimental economics research, because randomized evaluations often cost a lot of money and take a lot of time. So there are many barriers, but there are 3 barriers that we think are particularly tough to overcome. Those would include access to funding, connection to networks, and exposure to randomized evaluations and training opportunities. So seeing how these barriers were preventing us from increasing the representation of African researchers in our network, in 2019, JPAL's Digital Identification and Finance Initiative, more commonly referred to as DigiFi, led by Tavneet Suri, designed the African Scholars Program. JOY became the second JPAL initiative to incorporate the program into their funding activities last year in 2021, thanks to support from google.org. And then at least one more initiative will be incorporating the model in 2022. So beyond the ethical imperative to increase the diversity of researcher backgrounds, perspectives, and opinions in economics, we're also doing this because we believe that bringing more voices into the field will lead to a richer body of evidence. I think we can all imagine that individuals who have an intricate knowledge of a country and have connections to local authorities are better placed to identify policy relevant questions and better placed to ensure the research findings are used effectively. So what are the elements of the African Scholars Program? There are 4 key elements. First, we have funding. So this is the first and kind of the key component, which is that this program opens up JPAL's funding to African researchers, because usually JPAL funding is only available to affiliates and invited researchers who are already within JPAL's network. The second component is application support and mentorship. So during the application stage, JPAL staff offer a call with each African Scholars team whose letter of interest is accepted, in order to provide some feedback on the research idea and answer questions from the team. Then, for those whose proposal is successful and who receive funding, we pair the team with a JPAL affiliate or invited researcher who serves as a mentor to the team during the course of their project. Our third component is training and capacity building. So we also offer various training and capacity building opportunities aimed at increasing knowledge of randomized evaluations, supporting the generation of new ideas, and encouraging application submissions. And then finally, moving projects to the next level. So the ultimate goal for this African Scholars Program is to have more African scholars running randomized evaluations on the continent. So that means that after you've completed a project, JPAL staff will provide ongoing support with the hope of taking your projects to the next level. So if you complete a proposal development grant, that means moving it to a pilot. And if you successfully complete a pilot, that means moving it to a full-scale RCT. So eligibility. In order to be eligible to be funded as an African scholar, you need to have already completed a PhD in economics or a related field, so something like politics or public health. You also need to be currently based in an academic institution in sub-Saharan Africa. By academic institution, we mean university. So this means that unfortunately, think tanks are not included in this definition. That being said, only one person on the project needs to fulfill this definition. So that means we welcome you to partner with a diversity of researchers, diversity based on where they are working, as well as are they living in Africa or outside of Africa. We just need one member of the team to qualify as an African scholar. And again, I just want to note, African scholars are eligible to apply for our first 2 types of grants, proposal development and pilot. And then once they've successfully completed a pilot funded by us, they can apply for a full-scale RCT. All right, so now some tips for what makes a winning proposal. So when we review proposals, we're looking for a number of things. The proposal needs to be based on a strong research idea. It must be clear that there's a pathway to an eventual full-scale RCT. It must follow the application guidelines. It should be written clearly, simply, and succinctly. It should avoid some common mistakes, and it should be well planned. And I'm going to say more about each of these on the following slides. And then note there are also a set of slides included at the end of the presentation with more detail on what to include in a proposal. And I won't talk through them, but when I share these slides with you after the webinar, you'll have access to that information. So what makes a strong research idea? First of all, it's academically interesting. So this means it's making a contribution to the literature by addressing a gap in the existing body of knowledge on the topic that you're working on. Secondly, JPAL prioritizes research that's policy relevant. So ultimately, we want to fund research that has real-world implications and speaks to the challenges facing governments trying to advance development in their country. Thirdly, it must fall within the JOY research agenda, which we discussed earlier, and which you can get more detail on in the Q&A session to come. The slide also provides a link to the RFP overview document, which is on the JOY website, and which I'll include in the post-webinar email. And that contains a comprehensive summary of the state of the literature to date and provides links to a lot of relevant papers. And I do want to stress it's important to demonstrate in your proposal that you understand the current state of knowledge in the area that you want to study and can motivate for how your project fills the gap that exists. And then finally, it needs to be an idea that is RCTable, by which we mean it's a cause and effect question where an intervention is being implemented. You're able to randomize how it's implemented so that a randomly selected group receive it and a randomly selected group do not. And then at some point, you're able to measure the outcomes of the two groups to see what the effect of the intervention was. So we've mentioned this, what is a clear pathway to a randomized evaluation? What do we need to see in your proposal? Well, first, the proposal needs to include a program that's either already being implemented or will potentially be implemented in the future. So in other words, there needs to be an intervention or planned intervention described as part of the proposal. For example, it could be something like a program to train unemployed youth on how to write effective resumes, or a program to provide transport subsidies to help job seekers search for employment. And in addition, it must be clear how the program can be randomized so that a randomly selected group receives the program while another randomly selected group does not. And then if you're submitting a pilot as opposed to a proposal development grant, there needs to be an indication of commitment from an implementing partner. And there also needs to be a clear explanation of how the pilot will lead to and inform a larger full-scale randomized evaluation. So it may seem obvious to say, but following the application guidelines is an important part of submitting a good proposal. I'll just make a few points about a pilot. So because a pilot is expected to be a more developed idea and more funding is being requested, more information is required in the proposal. So in particular, the proposal narrative should include the following. So there should be a problem statement. And here it's useful to include findings from a needs assessment and your theory of change. I'll say a little bit more about that shortly. You should explain your unique contribution to the literature, the policy relevance of the intervention and your findings, a clear description of the program to be implemented, how you plan to conduct your research and what outcomes you want to measure, what population you're targeting, and then an explanation of the current relationship with implementing partners and any history you have of working with them in the past. We will provide quite detailed guidance for what to include in a proposal for either of these kinds of grants on the website after the letter of interest deadline on the 15th of March. So how the proposal is written is also important. So some basic tips include making sure that each section speaks to the heading it's under, using a clear title for your proposal that captures the spirit of the research, using clear and concise language, making sure to cite relevant literature, and reviewing your proposal and asking others to review it before you submit. And in these slides at the end of the presentation that you'll see when I share them with you, there's some links to useful writing resources that you may want to use. So there are a few common mistakes we've encountered that have been made in proposals that we would like to advise that you try and avoid. So first of all, make sure to include sufficient detail about your program's theory of change. So what is the need you're seeking to address? How will the inputs and activities your program will provide address those needs? And what outcomes do you expect to see as a result? Secondly, explain the intervention and evaluation approach in detail. So that means providing details on sample size, what the treatment involves, how you plan to collect data, how you'll randomize who receives the intervention. I know I just said that being concise is important, but that definitely shouldn't come at the expense of providing sufficient detail about the intervention and how you will measure the impact of the intervention. And then another common mistake is not clearly laying out that pathway to a full RCT that I just talked about. So again, remember, the end goal for JPAL funding is a full-scale RCT. So we need your proposal development grant or pilot application to clearly explain how your work that we're funding now will lead to a full-scale evaluation. Finally, I'd like to note a few things that you need to account for when planning your work, specifically related to timelines and budget. So the first is IRB approval. JPAL requires IRB or ethics approval for any project which involves data collection and research. And this means that funding won't be paid and your project activities can't start until you've obtained this approval. I've included a link to the African Scholars FAQs on the slide, and there will be another resource I share with you after the webinar. They provide more information on the process and how to find an IRB if your institution does not have one. Most institutions do, so that should be your first port of call. I want to note that IRB approval can take a month or two, depending on how busy the board is and the number of changes or adjustments that they ask you to make to your research design. So that potential delay needs to be accounted for in your planning. And then also, some boards charge a fee, some don't, but some do. And so you need to ascertain this before you submit your proposal and include those fees in your proposal budget. And then a second point is the timeline of receiving funds. So if your proposal is accepted and we tell you that we will award you funding, if you need to receive your funding in advance of starting work, as opposed to operating on a cost reimbursable basis where you incur the costs and then we reimburse you, it can take up to 4 months to receive the funding after we tell you that you have been successful. So please make sure to account for this timeline in your planning. So if you're thinking about applying, what are the next steps? So this current RFP, which we're calling the Spring 2022 RFP, opened in mid-February. Letters of interest, which are a short description of the proposal that you intend to submit, are due by the 15th of March. And then for those who progress to the next stage, full proposals are due on the 26th of April. I do want to note that you need to submit the letter of interest by the 15th of March in order to be eligible to submit a full proposal in April. The point of the letter of interest is to ensure that your idea falls within the scope of JOY and that at least one member of your team is eligible to apply under our African Scholars Program. This letter of interest needs to be submitted online, not by email, and the details are on the JOY RFP page. And if there are issues, there's an email address to contact if you encounter issues. In that email I'll send to you after this webinar, I will be sharing a PDF version of what the LOA letter of interest form looks like so that you have an idea of how to structure your letter. And then just to note, we host these requests for proposals twice a year. So if you're not ready to submit a proposal in this round, we plan to run our next one in August or September this year, sorry. So many of you may already be doing this, but to stay in touch with us, in case you are relatively new to JPAL and JOY, there's the African Scholars Registry to sign up, and that's where that's the key way for you to stay in contact with us around African Scholars opportunities across initiatives, not just with the Jobs and Opportunity Initiative. For JOY specific information, there's the JOY African Scholars webpage link there, which you'll get when you receive the slides. And then the African Scholars FAQs, which I've mentioned a few times before. All right, So thanks so much for listening. I'd now like to open it up to you for you to pose any questions to us that you may have about JOY, about the African Scholars Program, or anything else related to what I've just covered. You can either unmute yourself or you can drop your questions in the chat. If anyone needs to drop off at this point, that's fine. And just a reminder that we are recording the session. So does anyone have any questions for us? No questions in the chat yet. I've got some prepared questions to put the JOY staff on the spot if no one has a question. Ah, Lillian, you have a question. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yes, I already did. Thank you so much for the presentation. My question is around the qualification for application.
Mm-hmm.
So the candidate must have a PhD to apply. Okay. Because for me, I have a master's and I've done a fellowship with the World Bank Group.
Okay.
And I have also worked with mathematical policy research on a number of randomized complete trial, projects, which I'm even currently working on one that has to do with food security and women empowerment. So I've sort of built experience around that, but from this presentation, it seems I'm not eligible.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we do need one. Remember, you can apply as a team. So we need one person on the team to have already completed their PhD and be based at a university somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. But a team can include many people and only one has to meet that definition.
Oh, perfect. Thank you so much. It's clear now.
Okay, great. That's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got a question in the chat. Can the proposal be on the evaluation of existing government policy to create jobs for the youth? So yes, potentially. The key thing here, so many of our projects, JPAL's projects across its different topic areas and initiatives, evaluate government programs. That's really what we're looking to do, because we want at the end of the day to identify funds, identify programs that governments can implement and really have an impact with. So yes, for sure. The only caveat here is anything that gets evaluated, whether it's a government program or an NGO run program or anything, any other permutation, needs to be something that can be randomized. So that means you need to be able to randomly select one group that receives the program and randomly select a different group that does not receive the program, and then be able to track the participants and kind of keep them separate. So those who receive the program receive it, and those who are not supposed to receive the program do not receive it. And then after the 1, 2, 3 years, however long the project requires, you measure the outcomes. So absolutely, we really welcome evaluating government programs. That's really great. It just, we need to be sure, you need to be sure that it can be randomized. Yeah. Okay, great. Mohammed asks, do I need to work within a team? No. If you're happy to go it by yourself, you're eligible as an African scholar and you want to just apply on your own, absolutely fine. So a team is an option. A team of one is fine. Richard, what's the relationship between JPAL and UC Berkeley-based SIGA? We have a close, I wonder, Lisa or Daniela, do you have a clear answer to this question? I know we work closely.
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. It's a great question. Yeah, so we definitely consider SIGA like a close partner organization. I know they have a great East Fellows program, I believe it's called, for scholars who are based in Africa as well. But yes, so we're definitely like separate organizations, but we partner closely. One of our initiatives, or actually several of our initiatives, the Agricultural Technology Adoption Initiative and DAISY, Digital I'm blanking on the full name of it, are ones that we actually co-host with SIGA. So we definitely partner quite closely with them, but I don't know if there's a specific question about how we collaborate, but we definitely consider them a close partner organization. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, Richard, Yes, it does. Great. Thank
Sure.
you, Lisa.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Ofu asks, to be eligible, do you have to hold a PhD? So yes, one person on the team needs to hold a completed PhD. Let me go to the previous question from the net. What of someone who?
Claire?
Yes.
Yes, Claire. I think one of your conditions for applying for a full-scale RCT project is a previous, pilot or something.
Mm-hmm.
If I have that pilot done closely with, sponsored by SIGA, that's why I asked the question about SIGA, and not necessarily JPAL, will that suffice to show that I want to move to the next stage? I don't yet have funding from SIGA because none has been advertised yet, but I want to move towards JPAL because you already have a relationship. Will that also work?
So the pilot does need to be at least partly funded by JPAL, but it's a good point to raise, in that you can apply for JPAL funding as like co-funding to go along with funding you've received from another organization for a project. So that's relatively common. So if you were to run a pilot and you wanted to do it with SIGA and they provided some funding and you ask us for additional funding, that's possible. And then that would count as a JPAL funded pilot.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Lynette's question in the chat: what if someone who's based in university but on a part-time basis and not a permanent employee but has a PhD? So this is where our definitions, sometimes we need to do this on a case-by-case basis, but our requirement is that you could hold multiple positions, but that your primary affiliation needs to be at a university. So I think part-time and not permanent is probably not. What we really need is let me be clear, what we need is that you are at a university, the qualifying African scholar is at the university and is going to be there for the entire length of the project. And this requirement around being at a university relates to us wanting to ensure that who we fund that we only fund people who have academic freedom to publish their findings. And so we need to be sure that you will be at a university for the entire duration of the project, which it might be difficult for you to kind of prove or verify if you're part-time and not permanent. But that's kind of a question where if you want to follow up with us individually, maybe send me an email and we can discuss further. Let's go to the next question in the chat. Lillian will be sharing the presentation and the recording. Yes, I'm happy to share. The recording may not be immediate, but I will be sharing the slides and some other resources by email afterwards. I'm just going to do one more in the chat and then I'll come to those whose hands are up. Mohammed asks, how do I move from proposal stage to the next stage? So the idea there would be that you would use your proposal development grant to come up with a proposal for a pilot project, and then you would submit that in the next request for proposals. So say you applied now in April, you met that April 26th deadline. It might be a little soon to be able to fully submit a full pilot proposal in August or September, but maybe not, depending on what you're conducting. And the idea is that during your proposal development grant, you'll have had time to work, some money to conduct the kind of preliminary research you need to do, and you'll have had assistance from a JPAL affiliate or invited researcher as a mentor to help you create a pilot proposal that you would then submit. Let me go to Eugenie. You've got your hand up. Would you like to unmute?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I have a question that's very specific because I'm based in Burkina Faso, and because of a coup d'etat, some of the funding that we receive from outside the country has been put on hold because of the political situation. Does this funding apply? I mean, the political situation comes into play with this funding or not?
I'm not sure. I think there would have to be a discussion with MIT. Lisa, do you have an answer?
Yeah, I think, we would, definitely want to consider that on a case-by-case basis. And so we would probably be kind of asking questions about how the, like who the partners are in the research and how the coup has impacted the viability of your project and the program that you're evaluating. So I apologize that we couldn't give like a clear answer on this call, but I think if you have questions, again, you could follow up with us via email.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you. Ryodan, I don't know if I said your name right. Do you want to unmute and ask? Probably said your name so badly you don't know I've asked you to talk.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a very, two specific questions. The first one is it possible for a research team to submit more than one proposal? And then the second one is, I'm not sure if I got whether you provided an explanation for why you're restricting the eligibility to universities, because I'm based in Nigeria and we have a specific category of organizations that, I mean, these are research institutes. They're not necessarily think tanks. Sometimes they are affiliated with universities, sometimes they are not, but they do research primarily, and some do some training. That's the kind of institution that I'm based at. It's not a university, it's not a think tank. It's a research institute that offers postgraduate programs and also does research. So would this category of institutions be eligible?
Okay. Great. I think I got your questions. You faded in and out of it. So your first question was the number you can submit. So you are allowed to submit up to 3 proposals in a 12-month period. So you could submit 3 now to us. In this round, you could submit 1 now and 2 in August and September. You get where I'm going, there are permutations, but 3 in total. But yes, you could submit more than 1 now. And then your second question, this requirement is, maybe you did or didn't hear me just now, about requiring that those who we fund have academic freedom to publish, which isn't always guaranteed in think tanks. Now, I understand that you were saying there are research organizations in Nigeria that don't really fit a think tank definition, but aren't at a university either. My feeling is probably still that if your team didn't include anyone at a university, it would be ineligible. However, we do have to consider these sometimes on a case-by-case basis, because as you're pointing out, each country has their own setup with like bodies and how those operate, and having just one generic rule in one sort of sentence doesn't always cover all the permutations. So I would encourage you to email me. My email address is in the slides, or the Joy team also in the slides, and just tell us where you work so that we can look at your case specifically and see if you would be eligible. I'm going to go on to Hamadou's question. Do you need a JPAL mentor before you can receive funding? So no, most teams probably won't already know a JPAL affiliate or invited researcher and have them, kind of nominated to be a mentor before they receive our funding. So most often we are matching you to someone who has indicated an interest in being a mentor. They have an interest in labor topics. As best we can, we also try and make sure they have an interest in the region, or maybe actually the specific country that you want to work in. So no, you don't need to have a mentor identified. If you happen to have come across information on someone in our network that you would really like to work with and you think would be really well suited to your project for whatever reason, you could motivate for us to approach them to ask them to be your mentor. We couldn't guarantee that they would be, but we're certainly open to that. But if you know no one and you have no idea who should be your mentor, we will do that part of the process. Kwadwa asks, do you have templates or samples of the proposal to serve as a guide? So yes, we're actually working on providing some proposal examples. So previously funded proposals for pilots and proposal development grants to share with applicants. We've got one ready to share for a pilot proposal, and we're working on a few more. We're taking ones that have, real life examples that have been funded. And for that means we need to get authors' permissions before we can share anything. And that's a bit of a process, but we have one to share, and that will be shared with people whose letter of interest is accepted. And we'll be working on those. The next question, do you have a guide? I'm not sure if Mutuyu want to explain a guide on what exactly? Do you want to provide some more detail on what you're asking? Either in the chat or by speaking. I'm going to carry on. Okay, Quadra, you asked, can a research team submit more than one proposal? Yes, up to 3. And the last one from Ofu. Sorry, I'm not clear with the case of only PhD holders are eligible. If I have the capability to do a randomized model, what's the problem? Every organization has its requirements that, they have to put in place a set of rules that try to make sure that applicants and people who receive funding meet the basic requirements that are needed. And in this case, a PhD in economics or a related field is a requirement for one member of the team, one or more members of the team. I don't know what else, Lisa, is there something we can add to that? I don't know how else to say it, but it is a requirement and it's unlikely to change.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, JPAL at its core is like a research network based in kind of academic universities. And, but, totally to your point, we acknowledge that there are many people outside of academia who conduct high quality randomized evaluations. And so we're certainly not saying that that's the only pathway by which people, conduct these types of evaluations, but that is just part of kind of like JPAL's, kind of how JPAL operates as a network of academics based at universities. And so as part of the eligibility requirements for the African Scholars Program, it's sort of that is included also in how we think about eligibility. So, again, it's definitely not to say, like, we completely acknowledge there are many folks at think tanks at places like the World Bank and other places who are also conducting high quality randomized evaluations. And in a lot of cases, you'll see that there are many JPAL affiliates, folks in the JPAL network, who are partnering with folks at the World Bank and at other think tanks and such to conduct these evaluations. And so, sort of to Claire's point, we definitely welcome and encourage those types of partnerships, but this is part of our eligibility requirement that at least one person on the research team kind of has this eligibility of having a PhD and being based at an academic institution. I hope that helps. It's an excellent question.
Thanks, Lisa. Arinze, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Clara. Thanks for the presentation. I just wanted to ask regarding Misassessment. So is this something that must be done before you apply for the pilot? And the second thing is, when you talk about partner institutions, can you partner with research centers within the university, within your own university, to do things? Or does it have to be an external partner, just in order to consider the case of bias, for instance?
So on your second question, are you talking about the implementing partner being within?
Yes.
No, I think the implementing partner. This is a good question, Lisa. I'm sorry to defer to you again. Lisa, do you have any idea? The implementing partner is within the university?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that would sort of need to be on a case-by-case basis, because I see your point, and I think generally, I do think there have been cases. I would have to kind of look at it in more detail, and I would welcome Simon or Victoire, Daniela, anyone else who's on the call from JPAL to chime in. I believe there are examples of RCTs where the implementing partner is the university where the academic is based. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I see your point where there's maybe a potential conflict of interest, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, so I think that would need to be considered on a case-by-case basis. And Arinze, I think that could be a case where, it would be great if you could just email us explaining the situation in a bit more detail so that we could look at it a bit more closely. But again, I'd welcome anyone else on the team. I'm sorry. Yeah, I think this is more of a case-by-case basis. It's a really good question.
The reason why I asked is, like, I've seen a researcher within the JPAL network actually doing something with this research center.
Okay.
And then I tell myself, okay, so if you could do something with the research center, why can't I do the same thing? So, but then the case of conflict of interest now comes in. I'm working here, then I kind of have the bias that everything turns out well. Then another way to look at it might be, okay, I partner with someone external to do it. So in the case, you try to manage the bias or the conflict of interest. But I just said, let me just ask the question, so just in case.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. And I do think this, with the sort of academic freedom to publish, we assume that applies, including when you're evaluating a program within your own institution. So, I think the expectation would be that that standard would hold. But yeah, I think it's a great question. And yeah, if you want to follow up with us, we'd be happy to chat in more detail.
Okay, that'll be fine. And then on the question of the needs assessment, Claire?
Yes. So why I mentioned that was that one of our review board members pointed out that in a number of proposals received in previous rounds, it wasn't clear exactly what the needs were, how the team had defined what the need was, how they'd come to that information. So I don't think everyone who applies will have gone and explicitly conducted a needs assessment, for this specific project. What you may have done, and that could be very useful, but in general, more broadly, what I'm trying to get at is you need to explicitly say, this is the problem, this is the need that isn't being fulfilled. And then the second step is explaining the theory of change. Like, therefore, we will do X, Y, Z, and we expect it to have these outcomes. So it's just a clear kind of statement of problem. What is the need that exists and how is it going to be addressed?
All right, that'll be fine. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So in the chat, Avidemi asked, the budget guide for the proposal application indicates international travel. Does one actually have to engage in international travel for the proposal activities? So no, so the proposal development grant is also, sometimes we refer to it as travel/proposal development grant. In some cases, that grant is used in cases where the team are based in a different area or region or continent to where they want to conduct the study. So often, say American-based researchers wanting to conduct a study in India, they will use a proposal development grant as more like a travel grant, meaning they will use it to fund them to go to the place they want to do the study, to get some preliminary data, meet partners, whatever they need to do to kind of come up with a good pilot or RCT proposal. So if you're based in country A and you want to do the study in country B, and you need to travel to country B to get some information or build partnerships, then yes, you can use a proposal development grant to fund that travel. If you are living in country A and you want to do your work in country A and you don't need to travel, then you don't need to travel. You can use the money for other activities. Hamadou asks, for proposal development grants, are there limitations to the funding regarding whether you are based in the country where you want to undertake the research or not? I guess, sort of answered this, but no. So say you're based in Ghana and your project is going to be in Ghana. Maybe you're based in Accra and you need to travel to other areas. You can use the funding to cover that, local regional travel. If you don't need to travel at all, but you would like to conduct some qualitative research to get a better idea of what exactly the need is, or get some access to administrative data to design your pilot, that's what you can use that kind of funding for. So you can use it for travel within or without of your country, or no travel at all, and for other activities such as data collection. Lazarus asks, are workshops to engage policymakers eligible as budget items for the proposal development grant? I think I'm going to answer and then I'm going to ask maybe Simon to step in. I think the answer is, if this is about developing relationships with people that you plan to partner with, so a government agency that you plan to partner with to evaluate a program, then yes. So if it's part of that relationship building activity, then yes. Yeah, you need to be able to kind of clearly lay out why this activity will feed into you developing a proposal for a pilot or an RCT. Simon, do you have anything to add on that about the question? Are workshops to engage policymakers eligible?
Yeah, I think that your answer was really well said, Claire. As long as we can see a direct connection between that activity and an eventual randomized evaluation, then it should be good to go. I think what our review board would be looking at too is, does the cost seem reasonable, and is it clearly sort of an important factor in developing those relationships? But that type of item is definitely allowed.
Cool, thanks, Simon. Quadu asked, where can we obtain relevant literature to help in the writing of the proposal? So I think the key document that'll be really helpful for you is the RFP overview, which is linked in the slides, which I'll share with you, and I will attach it as a separate attachment in the email that I send after this webinar. And that overview has done a really good job of, saying this is what Joy's research agenda is. and this is what existing literature already has found, and this is what we don't know. And so, yeah, gives you links to literature, tells you exactly where Joy is focusing and what they're really looking to fund. So I think that's the best place for that. The next question, sorry, you're just saying you joined late. No problem. I'm sorry that you've missed a lot of what we've covered. All right, thanks. Simon has provided a link in the chat to the Joy RFP overview that I just mentioned, Pardon. But I'll email it to everyone as well. Thanks so much for the questions. We have a few more minutes, 5 more minutes if there are any more. Give me a second to think. Obviously, if you don't have a question now, but you have a question in a day or two or a week, just whatever, please feel free to email us. We'll do our best to get back to you as soon as possible. We really do want to provide as much support as we can. We opened up Joy funding to African scholars for the first time last year in the fall 2021 round, and we received a lot of applications. It was really encouraging, and we are hoping to receive a lot again this time. So if we can provide support via email as well, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks, and Daniela has just shared the overview as a Word document you can download in the chat as well. All right. Everyone's very quiet, so I think unless there are any last minute questions, we can wrap this up. Once again, really, thank you so much for attending and for asking those questions. It's a pleasure, Richard. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I hope it's been useful. And yeah, please reach out by email if you have anything you'd like to discuss. All right. Cheers, everyone.